What up, y'all? I'm DJ, and this is another episode of NBA Uncut. And with the trade deadline a bit less than a month away, there's a lot of things that could happen. Whether they're gonna happen remains to be seen. We got an article here by Zach Buckley citing one question that every team must answer at the trade deadline. I think just to switch it up a little bit, because I think if we were to just look at a trade target list, it'd just probably be 15 teams looking at Jay Crowder, 10 teams looking at Jordan Clarkson. It'd be a lot of repetitiveness, which considering as JJ Redick put it, this sort of false sense of hope that the play-in has created. Not a lot of teams are willing to fully buy into being sellers. They kind of in that middle tier gray area, which is where you never want to be as a team. But is what it is. Let's get right into it. First team up, the Atlanta Hawks. As you can see on the card, not really easy or not all too complicated. Is it finally time to trade John Collins? Short answer, yes. Long answer, yes. So I think the writing's on the wall that John Collins' time in Atlanta is well overdue. I feel we've seen him rise from young budding guy. You put him along Trae Young. You see that as your sort of not necessarily your dynamic duo, but to a sense, we've all seen the lobs that he's catched. We've all seen his ability to be that athletic big. We've also seen his ability to pick and pop. We've seen him exhibit all these really great offensive tools, but we see now where you add DeJounte Murray, there's a lot of chefs in the kitchen and all that, to where he's kind of relegated all the way to the point where he's not even averaging like 15. I'm not gonna lie, I thought he was a guy who would get back to 20 and 10 this year, with the fact that DeJounte Murray, solid playmaker. Sorry to mispronounce there. Trae Young, one of the best playmakers in the league. And, I thought John Collins was gonna feast again. I thought he was gonna get back to that 20 and 10 level. That borderline top 10 power forward, which, I think he still can hover around there. But I think in order for him to get back to there, it's going to be in a different situation. The obvious candidate is obviously Indiana. But, you think about the potential trade package. Is a guy like Miles Turner on the table, which I don't think would necessarily work unless you had the intentions of also moving a guy like Clint Capella, which, looking at all the pieces that the Hawks have to work with, I think it's something that, again, you see these constant reminders of teams that should work on paper, but, if Atlanta has been anything, it's been disappointing to an extent. But with that in mind, I think we obviously see that they've taken the role of the Utah Jazz, where, all the trade chat is around them, is this guy going to want out? Is this guy going to leave? All that's really like poisoning the locker room to an extent to where I think there's definitely going to be moves. Now, the Trae Young thing I think is a little overblown, but Nate McMillan I can't see being the coach here for long, and obviously here John Collins probably 1 foot out the door at this point. And I don't want to say I'm happy that he's leaving, but to an extent, in order to see him fully blossom and get back to that level where I think he can be, I think a change of scenery is definitely needed. So it's not a matter of when, or it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when he gets traded. Next up, the Boston Celtics, obviously one of, if not the best teams in the league right now. I'm a Bucks fan, so obviously got a little bit of contestation towards that. But their big question: can we count on the pasty princes of Sam Hauser and Luke Cornett to be in the playoff rotation? I think when you have as deep of a team as the Celtics have, we can all name them: Marcus Smart, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum. Robert Williams is starting to get back a little bit. If he's fully healthy, I think this question sort of answers itself. Not only that, Al Horford's still a solid vet, and they've got unarguably, I think, the best guard rotation in the entire league. If you look at it, Marcus Smart, Derek White, smart guy, Malcolm Brogdon, probably the front runner for Sixth Man of the Year right now. But my pick's Bobby, but that's besides the point. Luke Cornett, he's not a guy you really, I think, see as part of your playoff rotation. We've seen all the memes, the crazy shot contest. Sam Hauser, he could be a knockdown shooter at times, but are they really ready for that next push to get Banner? What is it? I think 17. Are they really ready to, what's the word? Exude these demons of last year's playoff run? And to an extent, I think they can. Because obviously these aren't guys you're going to expect to be playing top level minutes. These are, your 8 or 9 men off the bench type of roles. So I think it could, but when you look at a team like Boston, you look at their window, it's one that's, while open, is, kind of, it has the potential to slowly close potentially when you see guys like Al Horford getting older, you see guys like Robert Williams going through injuries, and I think it all points to them potentially making a move for sure. And whenever it's a matter of if it's a guy like Jakob Pertl or another potential big man on the market, I like the idea of a guy like Mike Muscala, because it's not necessarily that you need to get a guy who's going to play heavy minutes, but you would feel a lot better, I think, going in with a little more aged guy like, I say again, Mike Muscala. Jakob Pertl is obviously the big whale in this entire conversation, so we'll see what happens. And when it comes to Boston, having to plug up the latter half of your bench is a good problem to have for the playoffs, I think. Brooklyn, nice. Okay, where is the biggest front court need? I mean, when we look at the Brooklyn Nets, everything's humming right now outside of the KD injury. Get well soon, by the way. Nicholas Claxton's playing like a DPOY candidate. Ben Simmons is back to an extent. You see him obviously kind of getting back into the rhythm of things. I mean, that's what you need after you're not playing basketball for 2 years. And I think obviously, I think what they're really lacking is a solid backup center. Can't even think of the top of my head who it would be. I mean, you play Ben at the 5 to an extent, but when I think of it, it's definitely there's no need for power forward. KD alone is enough for that. You got Ben Simmons who can play that to an extent, and I think what they're really lacking is a solid. Doesn't necessarily have to be even like a big size big. Like a guy I'm thinking of is Naz Reid. The Timberwolves haven't really talked about extending him, so you had him to that front court. Whew, that could be solid. His ability to pick and pop, his ability, to play a lot bigger than his 6'8" frame would indicate. I think that would be a solid option for sure. But again, having to look for a backup as your biggest need is a solid question, or a solid problem to have, I'd say. Charlotte, what's the right play? Let me say that again. What's the right price at the deadline and in free agency for PJ Washington? Now, I'm not gonna lie. I'm someone who's in the boat that they should sell pretty much everything outside of, I'm not going to lie. I don't think they should sell PJ Washington and LaMelo. I think those are kind of the two guys that you don't necessarily build around, but those are your stable pieces outside of obviously young guys like Kai Jones, Mark Williams, James Bouknight to an extent. So I think what we really need to ask here is what's the right price for guys like Terry Rozier? What's the right price for a guy like Mason Plumlee, who's, outside of the memes and the little dribble moves he gives here and there, has been a solid big this year. I think he could definitely be a guy like, if you imagine him on the Celtics, I think that perfectly fills up your hole there. I think Mason Plumlee is a guy that can definitely contribute to a winning team as a backup big. We've seen his ability to do in a starting role. I think having that reduced pressure of going back to the bench where he's been for most of his career, no disrespect, I think that can be really helpful to a team looking for a backup big in the playoffs. And Terry Rozier, whew, that guy has 6-man candidate written all over him. Obviously, he probably wants more of a starter role, but you can't take all the good with the bad, or you can't take all the bad with the good, or whatever it may be. You look at a guy like Malcolm Brogdon. There's no doubt he'd be starting on majority of the other teams in the league, but we've seen his ability to buy into a role, not only as the 6-man, but as that sort of veteran. And we've seen how he's been humming on the Celtics. Terry Rozier, I think, can do that to the same extent, where maybe he might not give you all the assists. Well, granted, Malcolm Brogdon doesn't really do that as much too, but Terry Rozier, I think, really has a chance to impact winning. And as great as he's been to watch in Charlotte, he's definitely a guy that I want to see play for a ring in his career for sure. Now, thinking of a team where he could go and do that while still maintaining a decent sized role and usage rate, that's the tricky thing. You got teams like maybe Phoenix, but that's a long shot. Because if you think about Terry Rozier, yeah, you might not think he's going to get you like multiple first round picks, but when you look at the production, his contract I think is pretty solid too for his production rate. It's something that definitely has to be taken to the table where it's not going to be a dump and trade, is what I'm trying to say. And when you look at all the teams, all the landscape in this league, Terry Rozier can fit a lot of them in terms of being a bench role and being that, the leader of the bench mom in a sense. And I think it's questions like that we got to ask rather than a guy like PJ Washington. Now, I could be saying all this and, PJ Washington gets traded tomorrow because I think there's still the possibility. But For a guy like PJ Washington, I think he still fits the timeline of a LaMelo-led team. And you really got to ask questions about, again, guys like Mason Plumlee, Terry Rozier. If Gordon Hayward was even remotely healthy, I think he'd throw him in there too. But I just don't think there's a team that's willing to take that risk for how much money he has on his contract left. But, you know, oh, and I completely forgot. Oh my goodness, Kelly Oubre Jr. Holy. I want to see him get moved, but I also think you've seen how he hasn't played basketball in the last little bit with his injury. So I think teams might be a little hesitant because if you're taking on a guy like Kelly Oubre, you're also potentially looking at extending him. That's why I think you've seen the rumors of him going back to the Suns. I don't think that's very likely because they still have the whole Cam Johnson situation where they have to extend him, or even if they do in general. So Kelly Oubre is probably the wild card here because he's been hooping entirely for this whole season when he is playing, and definitely be great to see him playing some playoff basketball. What team he'll do that for remains to be seen. So again, I think PJ Washington is kind of the wrong guy to look at here, and you got to look at more of like these 26 plus guys. All right, the Chicago Bulls, age-old question. Are we fully committed to this core, or should we pay attention to all of the external calls to blow it up? I'm not going to lie, I'm pro blow it up here. I think not even really rebuilding in a sense, but I think Zach LaVine is someone who's so heavily disrespected. I understand like the concerns with his knees. You got Lonzo Ball to worry about with that as well. But I don't think this team is too far away from being back to like decent. I'm not saying they're going to retool, trade away Vooch and DeMar and all of a sudden they're in contention. But, you know, when you look at what a guy like Nikola Vucevic could get you, when you look at the potential disgruntlement of DeAndre Ayton, it kind of works to an extent. Now, I'm not saying that's for sure what's going to happen, but I mean, looking at it, sounds pretty nice for sure. So I'm definitely in the lane of blowing it up partially, but I think you still keep guys like Zach LaVine, Patrick Williams, Lonzo, obviously. I think that'll also open up like opportunity for guys like Dalen Terry, Ayo Dosunmu can continue to get more burn and make Chicago back again, kind of bring them out of that mediocrity, that kind of, again, that gray area you don't want to be in. The Cleveland Cavaliers, who fills the small forward void? I mean, this is a pretty obvious thing. At every position except that 3, everything's like virtually perfect. Darius Garland, top level point guard. Donovan Mitchell, to an extent, has been the best shooting guard. I mean, Evan Mobley and Jared Allen, what more could you ask for a front court? I mean, you got Isaac Okoro here. Nah, all jokes aside, I really like the idea of a guy like Kenrich Williams. You know, a do-it-all guy, does the gritty work, can hit the occasional shot, and it gives you some decent size. I think when you look at a guy like Karis LeVert, I'm a big Karis fan too, and this pays me to say I think his play style is more suited to being more of like a 6-man. I'm not gonna lie, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when you look at when he starts versus when he's on the bench, it's very night and day, and to an extent. I mean, there's a reason people don't really like me. I don't really bet on Karis LeVert anymore because he's either gonna give you 30 or 5. So I think in replacement of all that boom bust potential in terms of scoring, having a more solid guy like Kenrich Williams can, I think, really improve Cleveland's chances of, you know, I think a lot of people, myself included, were thinking this year's just kind of a filler year. Not to say Kenrich Williams is what puts you over the hump, but kind of having more of that stability definitely improves your odds is what I'm trying to say. So, you know, there's a lot of small forwards that could fit this bill. Bojan Bogdanovic is always obviously a target. Kelly Oubre Jr. maybe, but you know, it's like, and again, it's a good problem to have when you have 4 out of your 5 like super top tier starters, and you just need one guy to really not even be like a heavy contributor, but just to steady the ship. Say that. Dallas. I mean, how do we ease the burden on Luka Doncic? I mean, you play Jaden Hardy. Who are we kidding here? Nah, I'm a big Jaden Hardy fan, but it's the age-old question. You know, what are the Mavs going to do to help improve Luka's chances? I mean, we all saw that story about the mural and how Mark Cuban got kind of butthurt over it, but it's true. In order for any team with Luka Doncic to have even a chance, he's got to drop 30 to 35 plus. And when you have that as your only real route to success and being like a surefire top tier playoff team, that's a really scary thing to have. We've seen multiple teams where you let one guy do all he can. If you clamp all the other guys, they're not going to win. We saw that with a team like the James Harden's Rockets, and everybody always draws the comparisons, and I think this kind of shows that the writing's on the wall to that extent. I mean, there's definitely a conversation to have if Luka's better, but that's for another video. So obviously, get Luka some help, man. Whether it's I don't even think it's got to be like anything crazy. It's Christian Wood, solid. But I think what they're really missing is another guy that can create his own offense, not necessarily be the total offense. But that's the problem with, I think, kicking out and just this whole like new NBA where it's all about one guy driving. If the lane's not open, you kick it out for a three. I think that's what's led to stagnation in a sense, where because players aren't really practicing these one dribble pull-ups, these middies, that's why that's become so valuable in the playoffs. Being able to not just stand around and wait for your shot is, I think, a skill now. It's a big skill. And definitely getting something like that is what will help Luka. All right, the Denver Nuggets. Do we have enough defense to contend? I mean, Aaron Gordon, been a super solid defender. Nikola Jokic, he has his chops here and there. Obviously, you're not going to depend on him to get you a crazy stop, but this team's humming for sure. We look at all the win streak they're currently on. I think it's like 12 or 13. It's a long win streak for sure. Definitely when you look at the home record, because that Denver altitude ain't no joke. They need a guy like Nerlens Noel. They need a guy that can really help to lessen the defensive burdens with Jokic, because obviously that's not what you're paying him for. You're paying him to like lead your offense and be the offense themselves. And I think Nerlens Noel is a guy you can get fairly cheap. Second round pick will probably do it. And I think he'd fit perfectly. It's one of the probably easier jobs. I don't want to call it like that, but it kind of is like that. Nerlens Noel, put him in here, play 15, 18 minutes. Those 15, 18 minutes I think are going to produce like a solid plus minus. And I think that's really what this team needs to work on. The defense is damn near perfect. But it's when you get to that defensive end and all the pieces and how they're fitting together and what are they doing in those non-Jokic minutes, I think really matters. And getting a guy like Nerlens Noel is an instant upgrade over a guy like DeAndre Jordan. So that's my pick. Detroit. Can our young players keep progressing without our veteran leaders? Yes and no to an extent. I mean, we've come to the age now where veterans aren't as cherished as they should be, I think. Bojan Bogdanovic, he's a guy that doesn't fit the timeline at all. But we've seen him kind of step into being the top scorer after Cade went down with his injury. And not to say that that's a problem, but I think the best way to really get this team not necessarily back on their feet, because, with no Cade, I thought they were going to be a team that could be the contend for the play-in. But that's obviously with the fact that Cade would be there. So that's completely shot. And I think with the fact that they're definitely in the bottom, they're contending for a guy like Wembanyama. I think you just get what you can for Bojan Bogdanovic. And again, like I said earlier, Nerlens Noel, he's a guy that I think can get you some decent value. But you want Jaden Ivey to really blossom into this number 2 guy that could be next to Cade. I think the only way to really do that, or not only way, but I think a way to get an early head start on that is to just let him play. Let him just make the mistakes. Let him and Killian Hayes just, do what they can. Just grind it throughout the year. And then next year, boom, Cade is hopefully back nice and healthy. You're there with a shiny new top overall pick. And that's it. I think Bojan Bogdanovic, he's a guy that should be playing competitive basketball. He's definitely not going to do that in Detroit. Golden State, it's the age-old question. It's their biggest problem. Is front court depth a great enough need to sacrifice a long-term prospect? James Wiseman is incredibly talented. We saw him as this number 1 kind of guy. His ability to be this sort of unicorn is what I think everybody always kind of labeled him as, and we've seen how that's not really the case. And we've seen also the fact that Golden State's trying to develop and contend at the same time. Not really the best outlook, I'd say. So, without a doubt, I think it is worth, and I don't even think you got to get like a crazy old 32 plus like age guy. I mean, if you get a guy like, say, Jakob Poeltl, he's what, 26, 27, 28, still fits like a solid time frame in terms of being at the tail end of this Curry, Thompson, Green regime and heading into this next one that's headed by guys like Jordan Poole, Jonathan Kuminga, Moses Moody. And he's still going to have a guy like Kevon Looney to be solid. So I think for sure, no doubt about it. I mean, Golden State's never really had like a crazy like head monster like center anyways. And you see everybody talking, specifically, Pee Wee DePlug, shout out, always talking about how Jakob Poeltl can be the Andrew Bogut. And I definitely see it. I think they don't need a crazy boom bust guy like James Wiseman. I think what they really need is just some stability. And that's something that I think a guy like Jakob Poeltl could bring. And yeah, James Wiseman I think still has a crazy bright future ahead of him. But I just think that with the expectations and the fact that he does not fit this system all that well, the best option is definitely for them to get what they can and move on. Shore up what you can with the front court. Be able to, put some pieces together in order to make, one or two more solid runs before Curry obviously like calls it a career. So we'll see what happens. Houston, man, I don't even want to talk about it. If Eric Gordon goes, who's giving guidance to the youngsters? I don't know. They don't value veterans anymore. We've said that. I mean, I've said that like earlier. I mean, Eric Gordon's a guy who's been in like basketball purgatory in a sense. And, last thing I'm going to say, I hope he gets traded. I hope somebody is able to like make the money work and he's able to contribute. Because I think, he's what, 33? So obviously the years for his production are starting to run low. But the way he's playing right now, he should for sure be on a team playing meaningful basketball. And I mean, to only look at that, just a little quick tidbit. Alperen Sengun should definitely be leading that offense. They should definitely be letting him play that sort of like baby Jokic role in a sense. We've seen what Sabonis is able to do. We're in the age where positions don't exist anymore. You don't need just the one guard to initiate your offense. If this thing runs to Alperen Sengun, could be pretty sweet. But again, I think you just let Aaron Gordon in order to do right by him, let him spread his wings, let him go. Let him go be a veteran on another team that has a chance of winning a chip, or at least like contending in a sense. The Indiana Pacers. Have we played well enough to make buying a legitimate option? I think they have. Well, with the whole Tyrese Halliburton missing or like injury, it's obviously kind of dampened this a little bit, but the Indiana Pacers are one of the biggest surprises of this year, I think. I was somebody who thought they'd be around the play-in, which they are to an extent. But we've seen this year where they've been able to be in solid playoff positioning. I mean, Aaron Nesmith is a guy who's probably going to be looked at as somewhat of not necessarily a steal. But when you look at how he was just kind of just thrown into this trade in order to end up in Indiana, it's looking pretty good. Miles Turner, I hope they're able to figure out a contract. Buddy Hield, a solid vet. And, I'm not going to lie, nobody wants to admit this, but Buddy Hield's going to go down as one of the best shooters of all time. I mean, when you look at his numbers, it kind of makes sense. And I mean, look at this picture. Andrew Nembhard, Canadian boy. He's looking like a super duper solid steal. I mean, this team has all the assets to, I think, make a decent splash. But it's also, I think, you kind of let this team develop naturally in a sense. I don't think they really need to make a crazy addition. Unless a guy like Miles Turner wants out. I think that's really the only time where you're going to be like, okay, this guy doesn't want to be here. Let's see what we can get for him. I think that's the only time when you consider turning yourselves into, to that extent, you might not be buyers then, but, this team is pretty solid. If anything, I think the only guy, if they were to be buyers, that would be an option to sell is a guy probably like Chris Duarte. What's he going to get you for that? I'm not all that sure. And, if they are able to land a guy like John Collins, that would be crazy. That would be spectacular. But, I think they only really need to go into this whole sort of buying mindset if they're seeing the writings on the wall that a guy like Miles Turner won't return. That's the only time I see that happening. The Clippers. Do we need to trade for a backup big, or can we fix that in-house or on the buyout market? The Clippers are kind of this big wild card in this whole story of the NBA season. Obviously there's all the concerns about Kawhi and PG. Haven't played all that too many games together or in general. And we've seen that they've got a solid rotation. The only thing really missing is just that backup big, Ivica Zubac, as serviceable as they come, no doubt. But after that, what is it? Like, you play Nicholas Batum here and there, Moses Brown, who I love Moses Brown, but he's not really ready for playoff basketball, I don't think, or will be. I think that's the unfortunate truth. So I think you look to the buyout market mainly. I don't think there's really. I think what the league and what media always tends to do is it kind of forces people into thinking that they need this. And we saw that last year with the Clippers where, they need Kawhi and PG to be successful. And while, obviously that's true to an extent, we saw how Tyronn Lue was able to steady this ship, able to really get these guys to buy in and, make a solid playoff push or make a solid play-in push. And then, didn't end how you wanted it to, but you saw the heart really on display there. You saw this team able to really band together. And I mean, when Kawhi and PG are there, when everybody's fully healthy, I don't think there's many people who can fuck with them. I'm not gonna lie. So I think you mainly play the buyout market. I think kind of being able to push chips like, say, John Wall into conversation might not necessarily pigeonhole you, but it's definitely trying to make. It's like you're trying to plug up like a big hole when you just got a small little pocket, if anything. So that's my opinion on it. I think you just play the buyout market. The Lakers. I don't even want to talk about this. Are one or both of the 2027? Both. We've seen a team with LeBron. They don't draft. They don't use their picks. They just sell them off and see what they can get. And I think when you look at this team, that's their really only option to get even decent potential in contending. AD's obviously been out. Hopefully he's back soon. LeBron's been playing at a crazy level for a 38-year-old. And Russ is being Russ. He's played solid, being able to play in this new role, but they're really just missing like a piece. And that's not even to be into being a contender. I think that's just in terms of being able to survive in the West in general. So without a doubt, both should be on the table. I understand why you wouldn't want to, but when you have LeBron James, one of the greatest players to ever play the game, you just buy in all the way. Doesn't matter. If anything, though, 2029 is probably the one you keep, but 2027, I think for sure. Just trade that. The Grizzlies. Is this a championship level roster, or we need one more deal to get us there? I recently talked about how I think OG Anunoby would be a perfect fit here, and I think while that's true to an extent, I did get a little backlash on the fact that this team gels very well together, and I think that's true. For as annoying as a lot of NBA fans can think Memphis are, they're puffing their chest because they're winning. They're top in the West, or not top. They're tied with the Nuggets right now, and it's kind of like who is going to be the first to slip up at this point. But Memphis, I think, has all the tools to really be a solid contending, potentially championship level roster. I think they're definitely going to make somewhat of a conference final. Conference finals, I think, is the bottom line, and then you just want to get past that. I think, Jaw's an MVP level player. Jaren Jackson Jr. is probably the favorite for Defensive Player of the Year. Desmond Bane being back in the lineup. I mean, when you think about it, if you ask me, Jaw and Desmond Bane, probably the best backcourt in the league right now. Or one of, for sure, when you got guys like DG and Donovan Mitchell. But, if anything, I think this team is just missing a guy who's a bit more consistent than Dylan Brooks. Dylan Brooks is a guy who either gives you, you know, 30 on 45 to 50% shooting, or 10 on like 30 to 25%. There's really no median, I find. So I think if there is a player to move, it might be him, especially with his potential contract extension looming. So I think if I am Memphis, you definitely just let this ride out. You've seen guys like Santi Aldama be able to really contribute to winning basketball. You see Steven Adams is one of the more undervalued players in the league. So it's looking sweet in Memphis for sure. I think you just let this team ride out, see what happens, and then you decide later on, like, okay, we lost in the conference finals or whatever not because of this, but if we had, say, OG Anunoby or whatever kind of upgrade there was, that would have been able to take us over the hump. So I think this year they're going to be relatively quiet. But then depending on what happens in the playoffs is where you can see Memphis make some potential noise, I think. The Miami Heat. What's the key for unlocking our half-court offense? Having some guys who can create their own shot outside of Tyler Hero. Miami, I think, is a team that, we saw them make the conference finals last year, but I think overall they're in that sort of gray area where you don't want to be. They're in mediocrity. I love Jimmy Butler, but I don't think he's really in that top echelon. He's still, I think, a superstar level player, but with the lack of consistent 3-point shooting, which is something I think you especially need this year, having a guy like Bam who doesn't even really take jump shots at all, it kind of limits your offense for sure, especially in the half court. When they know that unless it goes to Tyler Hero, everything's going to be pretty stagnant, or it's just going to be driving. That's easy to game plan for to an extent. It's easy to really key in on that versus having like multiple guys like Tyler Hero who are able to score at multiple levels, and seeing what's potentially out there. John Collins, another guy they could maybe target. I think they just need more guys that can create, more guys that have the ability to knock down shots, more guys that have the ability to, make people think twice before packing the paint against guys like Bam or Jimmy. And I think that in turn will make Tyler Hero's life easier. I don't even know what's going to happen with Kyle Lowry. I love Kyle, but a little old in my opinion. So we'll see. The Milwaukee Bucks. Oh man, this hits home right here. Will a healthy Chris Middleton solve our offensive issues, or do we have to do a deal for a solution? So I think short answer, no. Long answer, yes. So I'll break it down like this. So I don't, or wait, that's kind of flipped around, I guess. So yes, I think it'll solve the offensive issues. Do we have to do a deal for a solution? No, and somewhat. Like, I don't think it would hurt for sure. And now you have these reports of Serge Ibaka wanting out. So what are we going to be able to get to for him? I'm not sure. If we got a guy like I can't even think about who Serge would be able to trade for, because he hasn't really played basketball all that much this year. I mean, if you're able to send him over to a team like the Jazz and get I think Jordan Clarkson's obviously the big like fish that Bucks fans are hoping for. I'm somebody who's like, that'd be great, but I know that's definitely kind of a shooter's chance. I think more a guy like Malik Beasley, who is still going to be hard to get in terms of the assets that the Bucks have, but it's definitely more attainable than Jordan Clarkson. I think getting a guy like him would help. But I think for all the criticism the Bucks have garnered this year, it's the ability to create in the half court. It's the ability to knock down consistent shots. That's all Chris Middleton is. He's a guy who averages almost 50, 40, 90. He's practicing with the herd right now, which is a good sign. And inserting him back into this lineup, I think the problem was that they rushed him a little too much. I would have been totally fine if he sat out past the All-Star break or got back around there. So I think it was just a matter of jumping the gun on him getting back. With this setback, it kind of looks bad on the Bucks' part. And putting Chris Middleton back to this team would definitely be a solid boost. You see Drew really starting to up his play. Giannis is Giannis. And with the fact that they both might be coming back this weekend, it's just mwah, chef's kiss. And Mafuzi Chef, you're all right with me, brother. But I think Giannis was right. So we'll see what potential deal is going to get done. I think having that report come out right around the deadline is obviously it's up. Maybe it's diversion. Who knows? So yes, I think there will be a deal done. Do I think it's necessary? Not necessarily. I think if you have a healthy Chris Middleton, a healthy Drew, a healthy Giannis, there's hope for sure. The Minnesota Timberwolves. Are we comfortable keeping D'Lo long term, or is it now time to find his replacement? Well, this article is about a week old, so we've seen that D'Lo's a little disgruntled. He thinks he's an alpha and all that, and that might not be the case. So obviously, I think D'Lo's probably the biggest name that might be dealt during the deadline, no doubt. Or if it's like for sure, whether it will be. Again, I think this trade deadline will be generally like pretty dry compared to the past few years we've had. But if there's like a big fish on the market, if you can even call him that, it's D'Lo. So what are you going to be able to get back for him? Who knows? But I think for sure he's going to be wearing a different jersey soon. New Orleans Pelicans. Is Jackson Hayes a keeper, or is it best to move him for a shooter? I think undoubtedly you move him for a shooter. I think adding a guy like Joe Harris would be perfect for this team. You send Jackson Hayes to Brooklyn. He can learn behind a guy like Nicholas Claxton. Obviously, soak up some game from KD. He's not that he's going to be hitting like pull-up jumpers or anything like that. But Jackson Hayes, I think, is a guy who's definitely gotten lost in the shuffle in New Orleans. He's a guy that you took with a decently high pick. I think he was 10th overall in his draft year. And hasn't really had too much to show for it. Hasn't really had the best of opportunities. We've seen when there's injuries, he's got little bits here and there. And as you can see here, only 9 teams average fewer than New Orleans is 11.2 triples. And all of them have losing records except the Pelicans. So there's definitely a need for shooting, I will say that. I think a lot of that obviously comes down to the fact that BI still isn't playing. We don't know what's up with him. But I think being able to add a sharp shooter like a Joe Harris, that'd be something that would be instrumental to this team's success. And you also got guys like, I think, Jonas Valanciunas. So the Pelicans, I think, have the assets to really make a big splash. Now, whether they're going to be able to sacrifice that potential future financial stability of keeping this team here remains to be seen. But I think without a shadow of a doubt, if there's a guy on the Pelicans that they're going to move, Jackson Hayes is going to be a part of that package. The Knicks. Can we sniff out a star? I mean, every Knicks fan probably thinks that they can sniff out a star. I mean, Zach LaVine's obviously been in a lot of the talks, and there's just... I think they had the assets to do it for sure. You saw the multiple first-round picks they were able to garner last year. I think they've got 3 in this next upcoming draft. And you look at their play, how they've been doing. It's possible for sure. But I think with this team that you have, with all the assets, I personally on the ladder of like, I think you stick with this team. You see how far they can go first. We've seen Jalen Brunson, our still all-star level guard for sure. He's definitely someone who's getting snubbed this year. I don't think he'll make it naturally. I think it'd be more like a replacement, like a LaMelo Ball or DeJounte Murray from last year. But there's no way that Jalen Brunson's not in like the top 15 of guards. No doubt. Top 10 even to an extent. But sniffing out a whole nother star when you've got, Jalen Brunson, Julius Randle, you've got RJ Barrett's contract, which I think kicks in this year, if not maybe next year. And I don't think they necessarily need like a guy to complete their 3 or their 4 if you consider RJ a star. It's really a matter of just finding these guys who fit in between. And you've got a guy like Quentin Grimes, solid. Mitchell Robinson, solid. Miles McBride, solid. There's just a lot of quality role players on this team. But when you look at the things they're able to package with, potentially Obi Toppin, Cam Reddish, the 3 picks, they're for sure going to be looking for it if a team's willing to do it. Not sure about that. I mean, can you imagine like a Porzingis reunion? That's obviously completely out the norm. But man, can you? Oh, seeing a guy like Kuzma on this team would be disgusting. I would love to see that. So, sniffing out another star, I think it's possible. Will it happen? I'm probably about like 60 no, 40 yes. Like if it happens, be like, makes sense. If it doesn't happen, be like, yeah, I think they have the roster to really build with. And yeah, I mean, Julius Randle's playing back to his MIP level season. Again, Jalen Brunson's an all-star. RJ Barrett, he's starting to get his wings back. So if I'm a Knick, things are rocking. OKC, my Canadian brother. Should we actually consider any rebuild accelerating trades, or is it still about the future? How is this even a fucking question? The amount of picks that the OKC Thunder have, does it say here how many they have? No. But the amount of picks they have, they could build a whole nother roster. And you can only keep 15 players. So I think without a shadow of a doubt, there's got to be some kind of rebuild accelerating trade happening soon. If it's happening, I don't think it'll happen at the deadline just because, this is definitely, I don't want to say this year's a wash, but the fact that you don't have a guy like Chet and you see all his offensive capabilities, his ability to be that kind of, I think it'll be similar to what Walker Kessler's doing in Utah, which just an added bit of like playmaking and an added offensive game. And you add that to the Thunder, they're going to be scary next year for sure. Jalen Williams is a solid guy. Josh Giddey is starting to really transform into one of the better playmakers in this league. And I mean, Trey Mann off the bench, Lou Dort's a solid player as always, another Canadian shout out. And there's just a lot of things that could happen, and I hope that do happen. Most of all being the fact that they start to get off of a lot of these like picks. Because again, how are you going to hold 15 players on the roster when you've got like 17 picks? Doesn't make sense at all, right? So I think if there's anything that does happen, it'll be done in the off season. I think they just kind of stick the course for now, but for sure, I think Oklahoma should look into being heavy buyers in the offseason, no doubt. Trade deadline, I think it's better if they stick to where they're at. Obviously, unless you're offloading guys like Kenrich Williams or Mike Muscala, like the veterans who are, a bit outside the timeline, but could still add value to a team. And whenever any team dangles draft picks outside of Sam Presti's face, he might probably bite on it. The Magic. How many guards are part of our long-term plans? So you see here, Markelle Fultz, Cole Anthony, and Jalen Suggs. That's kind of their main three. And we didn't even talk about a guy like RJ Hampton. There's just crazy log jams at not only the guard position, but the wing position when it comes to the Magic. Because, Jonathan Isaac's coming back. And, Markelle Fultz obviously came back this year. So there's got to be something that happens, I think. Now, the guys you keep, I think, are probably Markelle and Cole Anthony. I think Jalen, for as much as people touted him to be this crazy guy, the guy that should have gone above Scotty, whatever it may be, I think he's in need of new scenery. We've seen how he's not really able to carve out like a consistent role in this offense by like the spotty minutes he gets. It's obviously Franz and Paulo that are really heading that monster, but there's no doubt that I think a team will give up at least a decent asset for Jalen Suggs. And that's not even the fact that you're considering, throwing other guys into that pile. What could Jalen Suggs and Mo Bamba get you? Probably something at least decent. And, Markelle Fultz is a guy that I think a lot of NBA fans are rooting for. We've all seen what he was supposed to be. That's obviously not what became of the product, or I hate to look at him a commodity like that, but Markelle Fultz, I think, still has a chance to really be that solid guy that lays the foundation in terms of keeping this team structured, being the leader, being the voice. So when Orlando's in the top of the East in the next few years, I would not be surprised if Markelle Fultz is still like a big part of that roster for sure. But again, I think Jalen Suggs is a guy you look at dealing. Mo Bamba for sure, and we don't even know what's happening with Bol anymore since he kind of lost all his PT. So, yeah, you definitely keep guys like Markel Fultz and Cole Anthony, I would say, and then Jalen Suggs is probably the guy you use to dangle out in terms of helping to get something nice. The Sixers. Can Matisse Thybulle help us, or should we be shopping him around? I mean, the dude don't play. So obviously, I think you should shop him around. I think you look at a team like the Nuggets. What are you able to get for him? I mean, I look at a guy like Peyton Watson's not playing. I'm not saying they'll be able to get like a prospect like him, but I think Matisse has really. It's similar to John Collins, where you saw the potential. You saw like him be solid. Matisse Thybulle's two-time All NBA or two-time All NBA defense. So there's no doubt that he can hoop. But it's always been this kind of offensive game that's not translating. And when you're playing with guys like James Harden and Embiid, that's really something you need to be on your P's and Q's of. But I think Matisse should definitely have a role somewhere. I don't even know if he's really playing all that much because I haven't really seen him on the court all that often. But, there's a team that'll for sure get him. I think a team like the Nuggets would probably be my pick. The Suns. Oh my gosh, what are we trading? I don't even want to talk about this. Jay Crowder don't play. I mean, what are teams really expecting from a guy who hasn't been on the floor all season? What are they really be willing to even give up? Because you got to match not only the $10 million, but Jay Crowder's not going to be a guy who's like, yeah, I'll come over, I'll do the exact same thing that would have happened if I stayed in Phoenix. No, he probably wants to be like a decent level starter, or one of the first guys off the bench. And I don't think a lot of the contending teams are really going to be willing to do that, unless, oh man, I really hope the Bucks don't get him. That's my only reason why I'm kind of salty on this. But yeah, I think the wording here is perfectly. Theoretically, Jay Crowder should be a quality trade chip, but as it says here again, it's tough to find a trade partner that has a need for Crowder and an expendable player who fits the Suns' needs. So I think Jay Crowder is just this guy who kind of shot himself in the foot to an extent. Sure, you can sit out. Every player has the right to do that. But, if teams aren't seeing you play consistent minutes, and when you're a team that's heading into the playoffs or looking to contend, you don't really have all that much time to really like let a player get their wings back under them and let them kind of like, get some reps. We've seen with the Warriors that's not working. So I didn't even really want to talk about this so long, but I don't think they're really getting all that much. If anything, maybe like a player like Cam Reddish, or some kind of like player that's this sort of project that we've seen flashes of, but still isn't really be able to produce on a consistent basis. That's what I'm thinking for a guy like Jay Crowder. I don't think you're getting anything much more than that. The Trailblazers. Oh man. Should we try and lock in the protection on the pick we owe Chicago, or are we at all worried about regressing? Man, Portland has been, I think, I don't want to say disappointing to an extent, because the roster itself, it looks alright, but with the fact that as they get slightly better, the rest of the league is getting immensely better. That's why you see Portland's kind of stuck in, again, this gray area, the spot you don't want to be in, where you're fighting for the play-in, and even if you get in, you're like a second-round exit at best. And I think Portland, man, Dame is a guy that I definitely want to see win a ring. It's not going to be here, but, if he's able to do something, I think maybe we're looking at post All-Star. Maybe he starts to realize the sense of urgency that he has to have. Maybe that, but that's really hoping on a prayer, I think. No doubt, I think there needs to be some moves made. And you look at a guy like OG Anunoby, would you be willing to give up a guy like Shaden Sharp and, unlocking protection on whatever the pick is? And I just think that there needs to be some there needs to be some vertical moves. I think a lot of what Portland's been doing has been kind of moving laterally. You know, Josh Hart, I think, is a solid guy, no doubt. But is he really going to play that big of a role that he plays in Portland if he was on a championship contender? Probably not. You know, I see him more as like a solid bench guy. You look at a guy like Larry Nance, what he does in New Orleans. And that's kind of what Josh Hart did to an extent. I think having him as a role there, as opposed to being like a starting level player, is kind of more suited in terms of winning basketball, in terms of potentially winning a chip. But Portland definitely needs to do something drastic, I think, with the fact that you got to extend Jeremy Grant soon, if he even wants to stay there, and with the fact that they're starting to slip into the standings. There's definitely got to be some sense of urgency. Something needs to be get going for sure. Sacramento Kings. This dude don't even play. How much are we worried about our backup center spot? A lot, I think. Or maybe not a lot, but again, it's a good problem to have when you're worried mostly about a backup rather than a starting level guy like a Jay Crowder. But, you see Rashawn Holmes here looking a little sad. He's a guy that don't really play all that much. I think as great as a guy like Sabonis is, you really don't need like a crazy solid like backup. It'd be nice, but more than anything, you just want a guy who can steer the ship, who not necessarily steer the ship, but you want a guy that can keep it afloat. You don't need a guy that can be a home run hitter. If you are able to get that, great. If you can't though, if you just get a guy who's serviceable, that's all that matters. I think a guy like, again, Naz Reid. I love Naz Reid. I think putting him on this team would be solid. Stretches the floor out a bit. And then, Sacramento is really solid. No doubt. I think it's just this last little bit that can help them really secure playoff hopes. Because right now I think they're third. But being able to, I think, really fully solidify this rotation is what they're really looking for. And being able to dangle out a piece like Rashawn Holmes might not be the best option in terms of getting a guy, but crazier things have happened. We'll see what happens, but not only that, I think it's just I just completely forgot about guys like Chimezie Metu, Trey Lyles, Canadian. So I think they have the pieces to potentially just kind of get what they can for Rashawn Holmes. Maybe just throw him out for a second, be able to get some kind of return versus just having him leave on his own accord. So we'll see. Again, having the problem of you only really need a solid backup is an okay problem to have versus, again, having to acquire a starting level player. San Antonio Spurs. Is there any chance we're assigning Jakob Poeltl, or are we just waiting out the market to maximize our return? It's definitely the latter. Jakob Poeltl is a guy who should be and could be contributing to playoff basketball, and I think he should be traded. Now, in terms of who's going to get him, I don't know. The Warriors is probably my pick just because, my mom's a fan, so just want to see her do well. But Jakob Poeltl is a guy who's a sneaky playmaker, solid as they come, and is just another guy you want to see play meaningful basketball. And he hasn't really done that all that much in his time. Was a part of the Kawhi trade, and we've seen how he's blossomed into this starting level player. We've seen how San Antonio develops their big mans. We've seen it. I mean, I don't really got to bring out the names, but I'm not putting Jakob in that list. But we've seen him really grow, I think, these past few years, and now I think he should really just spread his wings and go to a bigger team. And at 27, as it says here, I agree. He's a bit too experienced for a rebuilding roster, but you look at this team here, maybe could be an option, but I think that's kind of moving more laterally because you still got Jonas Valanciunas, but putting a starting level player and if he somehow goes to the Celtics, it might be over, no doubt. You put him on a guy like the Warriors, seeing the two-man center rotation of Looney and him, that might be what really, I think, unlocks this team's not only just their potential to be as good as they are, but to potentially maybe even hit a second gear even. You never know. So I think Jakob's definitely the big name that's going to be popping around popping around during the deadline, and we'll see what happens with that. The Toronto Raptors is resetting or at least retooling on the table. Absolutely. And we've seen all these reports. In my opinion, I think the only guys that really get traded are guys like Fred and Gary. You know, as much as teams are calling about OG potentially, as much as I think OG would be a dog in another team, which it's not to say he's not already, but the Raptors are, again, they're just in that middle ground, and being able to get off of guys like, I think Fred, who's run his course there in terms of being able to at the peak. Gary is a guy who's probably in the middle, but we've seen all these like reports that he's not going to accept his option. He wants bigger money. That is, I think, what might push him out the door and might lead him to being on a different roster. In terms of who's going to get him, I'm not sure, but Toronto, I think, should definitely look at retooling for sure. I don't think resetting is something that's fully on the table yet, but when you see guys like Miles Turner not being fully guaranteed their money, in a sense, not being guaranteed their next contract, and you look at the potential assets you have at getting that, I think you at least got to make a run at it for sure. So retooling, I think, is the better word here. Resetting is something that's like, man, all else has failed. We are completely fucked. Now we gotta look at this. But I don't want to say this roster is salvageable, because that makes it sound like they're what's it called, like completely in the mud, because I don't think they are. You got a guy like Pascal, who's a top 15 player in the league, maybe even like borderline. Actually, no, he's not top 10. What am I saying? But you have a top level player like Pascal. You have a guy like Scotty, who's really, I think everybody's completely being unfair to him in terms of saying he's like having this crazy regression, which the stats would say, but it's something you've kind of come accustomed to with these second year players. Sometimes it's that sophomore slump. So Scotty, I think, is still definitely a guy you build around. And being able to get off of guys like Fred, trading him for potential other assets, and being able to get a legitimate center, I think, is the first thing that the Raptors need to look at. And a Jakob Poeltl reunion would be crazy, but it could happen. You never know. But, you know, we'll see what the Raptors are willing to do. I think it's definitely those two guys, Fred and Gary, who are the ones that would be moved if there is anything that does happen. But I don't think a crazy Pascal trade's in the cards unless, like, it's the offseason. All right, Utah. How much selling is too much selling? I think you sell these two guys in the picture right here, and you're good. Maybe Jared Vanderbilt, but he's still a young guy who somewhat fits the timeline if you're able to get a guy like Wemby. But Jordan Clarkson, my Filipino brother, come to the Milwaukee Bucks, man. I mean, it'd be crazy. Or Malik Beasley. Either or, I'd be happy, like Bucks fan. But bias set aside. I think, you know, the Jazz is definitely the biggest, like, wow in terms of the season. When you look at what they're being able to accomplish with the roster they have, when you look at the star power they have outside of guys like Lauri Markkanen, not all that much, but I think this picture is perfect. I think you sell on these two guys because obviously you can't really get off of a guy like Mike Conley until the last year of his contract. And Jared Vanderbilt, I think, is a guy that every team needs. So if you're the Jazz, you want to have him for this rebuild that you're going through. And yeah, I think Jordan Clarkson's a guy who can fetch you a pretty penny on the market. Malik Beasley, the same thing. So I think it's these twos you get off of. And then when you look at the teams they got and what they might potentially get in return, the future's bright for sure. Walker Kessler, better than Rudy Gobert. Last but not least, the Wizards. Is Kyle Kuzma a better player or trade chip? We've seen all the reports. Kuzma wants a fat payday, which I think he's fully deserved. And then, you know, Kuzma is definitely deserving of that payday, and not only that, should be playing meaningful basketball. He's not going to do that in Washington, I'll tell you that much. Washington is probably the poster child of these teams that are stuck in the mud, these teams that are stuck in mediocrity. So, you know, I think seeing him as a trade chip is probably not necessarily disrespectful, but because Kuzma's developed into a crazy player, and I think he is willing or he's earned that payday that he's going to get. And I don't think it's going to come from the Wizards. So seeing who is going to be able to get that, I mean, I mentioned earlier, him on the Knicks would be nice. So he's another guy that I think is going to be probably one of the bigger names across the deadline that we're going to see if they do get moved. But I can see it happening where, you know, he just goes to get paid somewhere else for sure. Kuzma's a guy that can contribute to a team in terms of like being a potential playoff contender. He's a guy that is still relatively young. I think he's like 28. So his best basketball is at least somewhat ahead of him. But we've seen his ability to really flourish, his ability to really... We've seen what happens when you kind of upgrade him from a guy who just spots up. Seeing Kuzma being able to step into this bigger role, I think, has really not necessarily opened people's eyes, but kind of reminded them like, oh yeah, Kuzma is a dog. So I would love to see him in another situation because the Wizards, again, they're in that poverty level of basketball. Well, with that, this has been another episode of NBA Uncut. My name's DJ, and I'll see y'all next time.